I am going to begin by welcoming everyone. It's so good to have you here with us for our workshop series, Teaching Across Screens. I'm Stephen Muker, Education Program Director here at UC Berkeley Extension, and we're really pleased to have you here. One of the benefits of this workshop this week is that we've given many of you a survey, and I want to thank you from the offset for the amount of time and concern and interest you put into your survey. It gave us a chance to see who's attending this workshop. And one thing that's clear is you're coming from all over the country. So we welcome you from East Coast to West Coast, and glad you could be part of this expanded version of a workshop series that is typically small and interactive. And so I'm going to start by kind of describing what we're going to do today. We've made every effort with our panelists to involve you and to make this conversational at a time when we're going to have several hundred of you on this call. So the way we've done that is we're going to take questions and comments that emerged in your survey. We're also going to take questions and comments that you can contribute during the workshop through the Q&A feature on this webinar. And our moderator will be bringing up and surfacing some of the major topics and questions that you have during the webinar, so that Zakiya Sankara-Jabar, who's our facilitator today, will be able to handle those, ideally in more of a conversational tone. So we really want this work to come out of what you're doing on a daily basis in classrooms, and to allow that to be kind of the source of the content today. So with that said, I'll mention a few other things. There will be a survey at the end of the workshop, so we ask you to please complete that. You'll receive an email about an hour after this workshop ends, and that'll give you a chance to give us some feedback that allows us to adjust and make future workshops that I think will be useful to teachers. We also have a few upcoming workshops that I would suggest you look at on our Eventbrite page. They are relevant to the topic here, and we're really excited about those. And we love to see our participants come back and be part of other workshops. With that, you're going to meet Carrie Everett today, who's one of our colleagues here at UC Berkeley Extension. She will be answering and responding to Zakiya with certain questions throughout the workshop. And so she's going to be doing that by looking at the question and answer, and she also is familiar with the survey results. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, which is I'm really excited to do. This is Zakiya Sankara-Jabar. She's the co-founder of Racial Justice Now and National Director of Activism at Brightbeam. Zakiya was recently named to the inaugural Power 50 Leadership Fellowship for Women of Color with Community Change, and was featured in the HBO series Problem Areas. But beyond these and other impressive positions, achievements, and public appearances, Zakiya remains firmly grounded in advocacy focused around the place where so many of you spent your day today: America's contested and under-resourced K-12 public schools. I encourage you to read more online or at our event page to learn about Zakiya's activism promoting anti-racist and inclusive school practices as both a parent and community organizer. But for now, I want you to join me in welcoming to Berkeley, Zakiya Sankara-Jones.
Well, thank you, Stephen, Carrie, and the entire UC Berkeley team for having me to be a part of this most important discussion, making Black Lives Matter in and out of the classroom. That is something that is critically important. It's something that I live and breathe and has become my life's work. So I'm excited to be here. Want to encourage people to use the question and answer as I'm continuing to talk and give you a brief description of my work, the organization that I founded and why I founded the organization, and also bring you up to speed on the kind of work that I'm doing now to make Black Lives Matter in and out of the classroom. The other piece I want to share with you is that this is not intended to be any kind of sort of lecture style. I want this to be as conversational as possible. So I will share about best practices that I see in the field that make Black Lives Matter. And then we will field some of your questions, and hopefully I'm able to share some tools, some resources, and some different strategies that has either worked for me or organizations and people that I'm in network with across the country. So having said that, as Stephen mentioned, I co-founded an organization called Racial Justice Now. That organization was founded in Dayton, Ohio, back in 2011. And I had the unfortunate experience as a mom, as a parent of my then 3-year-old son being expelled from preschool. And that is actually how we began to start organizing, and why we began to start organizing around this issue. I had no idea that it was an issue, this issue of the preschool to prison pipeline, until I experienced that very up close and personal. I wasn't very politicized at all around racial or social justice or anything at that time. Clearly, I'm a Black woman in America, so I knew just racism existed, and certainly I didn't know to the extent until all of the different areas, of course, and including education, had not really thought about that as an experience, even in my own upbringing, which was in the South. So when I had that experience, I began to organize other Black parents, particularly Black women, who had similar experiences. And I want to share, because I do think that it's important, especially since we have a number of K through 12 teachers, or pre-K through 12 teachers on the line. One of the things that I've learned through that experience is the critical importance of authentic, and I think underline the word, bold, italicize the word authentic, parent, community, and school relationships. And the reason why I say that is because for so many of the parents that I've organized in working class Dayton, Ohio, most of those women are working class Black women, you know, right above or some right below the poverty line. And so there are a lot of different areas where there is lack. And so the reason why I bring that up is because there's already a level of stress in trying to manage the basic needs of the household, and then also the stress of being called to the school constantly, their children being suspended, even expelled again as early as 3 years old, and not necessarily having a support system in place that makes sure that the young people are continuing to learn, but also that they're not continuing to have a bad experience with their education that makes that some young people dislike education. So that was one of the main things that I found in organizing in working class communities. But the other piece that I noticed was the kind of pathologizing of working class parents and some of the judgments that sometimes come from educators, sometimes come from principals, and just all around policies and practices in communities like that. And some of those policies where parents were not allowed to either come and visit, do site visits, or just wellness checks to make sure everything is okay, particularly when they were constantly being called about something about the child or some kind of disruption or something like that. There were certain policies in place where parents would have to call and make an appointment, and if they didn't, the police were called on them. This is a criminalization. To me, this is a connection between the criminalizations that we see in communities of color generally, but sometimes we don't necessarily hear about in the media that happens also sometimes at our school door. Also having the experience now that I live in the DC region, I saw there was an educator that filled out the survey from Montgomery County, Maryland, is a teacher at MCPS. Shout out to you if you're listening. I live also in Montgomery County, Maryland. My son attends MCPS now, and so this is a suburban school district, and no such policies exist. It doesn't mean that the school district itself is certainly perfect or has everything right when it comes to racial justice in education, but there are certain differences, particularly along class lines, that you won't see in a community like this versus you'll see in inner city schools like Dayton Public Schools or Cincinnati or even Baltimore or Washington, D.C. And so I think that those are some of the things that parents and that are barriers, if you will, to authentic community parent engagement. The other piece that makes that important, obviously we're in a pandemic now, and so everything has changed, and I want to talk a little bit about that because I saw that also come up in the survey. Some of the frustrations certainly around the technology. That's a huge issue right now. And the organization that I'm with now, Bright Beam, where I serve as the National Director of Activism, one of the main campaigns that we've had to launch as a response to the cities that we're working in, which are Washington, D.C., Minneapolis, St. Paul, Oakland, Bay Area, and also Chicago, is the lack of internet access, is the lack of broadband, is the lack of even basic essentials. Some families not even having laptops or Chromebooks. Some school systems didn't have enough Chromebooks to give out to all families. So there's just been a lot for families to be able to deal with. On top of that, the other things that we're concerned about as well that has not been completely thought through is this idea of supporting families who are also direct frontline workers. Many of the families in lots of communities across this country, particularly in Black and Brown communities, they are essential workers. And so some of those families are finding trouble being able to support their children during virtual learning because they also have jobs that they cannot work at home. They have to be outside of the home. So there's a number of different things that are certainly of concern now in making Black Lives Matter in and out of the classroom, and also certainly with the technology issues and the lack of access for many families and communities. So that's something that we're definitely working on. We're working on it at a number of different levels. So certainly at the local level, working with particular school districts to work directly with the companies themselves, such as Comcast. I know Chicago has struck a deal with Comcast to provide some internet capabilities for families there. And then we're also working directly to push our government agencies like the FCC to step up and regulate and do the right thing and make internet for all a reality. That's where we are at this point. Certainly, internet is a public utility anymore. It's just like having a telephone, right? It's just like having, what else do we need? Electricity. I mean, it literally is a public utility. And so that is something that many of the activists that I get to work with in different communities to make sure that they are having access to that and working with the respective entities to make sure that happens. The other thing I wanted to mention in terms of the climate that we're currently living in, this is a very unique climate where we're dealing with a pandemic. None of us alive have lived through a pandemic. The last one was in 1920. The other thing that we're dealing with, of course, especially our folks, if you're on the West Coast, is global warming or climate change, however you want to describe that, with the fires and everything like that. And then, of course, racial unrest, persistent racial unrest, where we're continuing to see the lives of Black bodies being cut down in communities across the country via law enforcement in other areas. And so that's something that's really critically important when it comes to trying to figure out how do you have these conversations with your students? How do you have these conversations as staff? how do you have these conversations, period, to make sure that students who are also dealing with this as a conglomerate. So we're also having to process a lot of anxiety and mental health crises. I was looking at some data the other day, I believe yesterday, it may have been World Suicide Day or it was recently, and I was shocked and really struck to see that Black boys, the suicide rates had almost doubled in the last 30 years. And that's something to me that's very concerning. And so I know as educators, there may be some telltale signs. There may be, something just for all young people, especially now, that we should all be cognizant of and looking for to make sure, that we're trying to support students and families as much as possible. So I think there's some questions now that's coming in. I'm happy to, to start fielding some of those. And if there's anything directly that people want to ask or anything specifically that I mentioned that you want to know a little bit more about, I'd be happy to take some of those questions. Carrie, are there any questions that we can take now from the community?
So there is one question from SL Janet, and forgive me, I've got a toddler that may pop in and out.
Me too.
Right. The question is, what would you say is the true difference between allyship and advocacy for Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Allyship for Black Lives Matter. I think that, that's something that to me is not clearly defined. I think that, again, authentic engagement and authentic relationships is something that is critically important. And so sometimes that can be through community organizing, sometimes that can be one-to-one, sometimes that can be through other forms of institutional building as well. So one area that I know that comes up a lot is certainly around leadership, right? And so being a good ally can certainly sometimes mean deferring to the leadership of the communities in which you're supporting, the community in which that you're seeking to ally with. Deferring to that leadership and also finding ways to authentically support and scaffold that leadership. If you're someone who has access to resources or access to some other kind of support network that you believe would help bolster the movement for justice, then I think that's something that could be worked on, or something that could certainly help in actually being an ally. An ally usually doesn't mean that you join an organization and then not necessarily seek to take it over, but then you're front and center. And I know that has been some complaints that I've seen in the past where some allies or allies from other communities and organizations come into sort of a Black Lives Matter space and seek to kind of take over the message or seek to infer sort of their own kind of messages or try to change the agendas. There's been a lot of tension, I know. And so that's actually a really good question because there's certainly a lot of tension around that.
Sure. Do you have time for one or two more?
Oh yeah, bring them on.
One of the questions from Jermaine Kennedy, what should white teachers be doing to counter inequities in their classrooms and teaching practice?
Countering inequities in the classroom?
Yes.
Certainly I think curriculum and pedagogy is critically important. One of the main things that as a co-founder of Racial Justice Now, we eventually launched what's called a culturally relevant curriculum campaign. And one of the things that we wanted to make sure was that young people themselves, students of color, all young people, honestly, could see an actual reflection of themselves in the curriculum, and also just a reflection of the country just in of itself. We're a very diverse nation. And so oftentimes the curriculum is certainly not reflective of that. It's not anti-racist, it's still very colonial. That's something that I believe is something that educators can do themselves. There's certainly groups out there that are advocating for that. There is the National Black Lives Matter Week of Action. That is one resource where you can use. There's a bunch of tools there. This is probably a good time for me to mention too, the resources that I mentioned to you guys will actually be included in your survey link. So there'll be links to some of these resources that I bring up that I discuss. The other piece is also around school discipline, right? So like making sure that we're not having punitive classrooms, but that we have classrooms that have restorative justice and conflict resolution, because these are skills that young people can actually use and take to the on throughout their lives. I mean, restorative justice is a philosophy. It's not something that you do. It's not like, oh, you got in trouble, now let's do this quote unquote program. That's not what it is, right? It's an actual philosophy and how you be with other people, how you make decisions even in more of a consensus manner. The same thing with conflict resolution. These are skills that young people can use throughout their lives to decrease the level of conflict that oftentimes we see in our communities, and certainly, unfortunately, now that we see even in our country.
Another question, Zakiya, that's come up, that's actually been a question that's been asked before, and that's with the age appropriateness of when to bring up some of these conversations with, you mentioned you're seeing some of these things as early as preschool, but teachers that are teaching in 6th grade, 12th grade, college, when is the right time to bring up some of these conversations?
You know, I get that there is a tendency to think, you know, we probably shouldn't be talking about this with preschoolers, or we shouldn't be talking about this with kindergartners or first graders. The issue with that is that young people are actually still experiencing some of these things that we're seeing, especially witnessing currently in the country and actually throughout the years. There's actually research to show that young people identify race as early as 3 years old. And they identify the fact that, you know, I'm different, because it's so inculcated throughout our society and media images and everything, that the differences along the lines of color and race and ethnicity, even language, all of that is included in that. So I don't think that it's too early to kind of tackle these conversations. Certainly you do it in a way that is age appropriate. I don't think that, you know, showing images, say for instance, of George Floyd, I don't think you show that video to a child. But I do think in order to process with young people who may have heard it through friends, who may have inadvertently saw it on social media, we're living in a totally different world. We can't afford to think that we are sheltering our kids somehow. Social media is like the new TV. It's the new media. Young people have cell phones. They're very in tune. There's TikTok, right? Like there's all of these different social media platforms. So I think as educators, we want to make sure that you all are armed with the resources that you need to be able to have these conversations in a way that's age appropriate, and have these conversations in a way that's both healing. Healing is something that is so critically important. And I'm sorry I haven't brought that up before now, because that's something at Racial Justice Now that we focused on. It wasn't just about advocacy, organizing, and policy change. One of the things that I found when we started to organize was that there was a cloud of anxiety, of hopelessness. There was a cloud of feeling defeated among our families, that I realized, you know, when people pathologize working class parents or Black parents, well, they don't care about their kids because they don't show up to the meetings. And I started to do some of that as an organizer. I'm like, hey, you know, I'm a parent too. And like, you know, this is what's going on with our kids. Why aren't people showing up to these meetings? And then it took a long time to build trust with these families to actually find out, oh, wow, you're facing eviction. What? Oh, wow, your lights were off. Like, these are families. And I know that, you know, I know as educators, you guys see it. These are families who are literally at the margins, where they don't even have their basic needs met. So to worry about a PTA meeting and they're worried about an eviction, right? And they're worried about their lights being off and how I'm going to get the money to make sure food is on the table. That's something that I even had to learn as an organizer. Even me as a parent at that time, and at that time I was a single parent. Even I had a little bit more privilege than the families that I was organizing. And so it took a while to build the kind of trust that I needed for those families to speak up to me and say, I wasn't able to come to the school board meeting because unfortunately I'm facing eviction, or unfortunately, you know, this other crisis is happening. So we had to do a complete reshift and say, okay, we can't just focus on saying, we're going down to the school board meeting and we're holding all these people accountable. We actually have to stop and take care of our people literally. So that meant that, you know, when we had our meetings, everybody was fully fed hot meals. Everybody had transportation to get there. Everybody had a gift card to like make sure that they're, you know, any kind of other expenses that they needed to incur. And we also had to provide childcare. Now that's stuff that costs a lot of money, right? To be able to organize effectively in communities that are at the margins like this. And so that's something that's critically important, is just realizing not in a way that's paternalizing families, because you'd be surprised at the brilliance when we had those meetings, the brilliance that we got out of those families. They know the issues. They also are closest to the solutions. And this is, to me, I feel like a good segue to share with you all one of the biggest wins that we got as a small community-based organization in Ohio. And if Ohio is one of the places where we have educators, I'd love to hear from you all, because this law doesn't fully go into effect until 2021. But it took us several years to organize and work with our state Senate, our state leadership, and eventually, at that time, outgoing Governor John Kasich. Now, this is very interesting, and this is something that I learned along the way, is the art of the deal, so to speak, or the art of negotiations, or the art of learning how a bill is made, right? And the art of learning how policy change is made. And there were some bumps in the road, and there were a lot of sleepless nights, and there were a lot of tears. Because what I learned, even though I had to work with, as a Black woman, or, you know, as a person of color, we had to work with a party that is not oftentimes very, I would say, responsive to the needs of communities like mine. If there's anybody in here from Ohio, you know that our state leadership there, our House, our Senate, our governorship is all, and this is not to get political, this is just to explain the process of what we had to do to get the kind of legislation that we needed for our community, and to give you the insight on the kind of conversations and the kind of you know, traveling and everything that we had to do to make this happen. But anyway, the party leadership that controls legislation in the state in Ohio is Republican. And so for us in Dayton, and even for parents that we were organizing around the state, we realized that we weren't going to get anything done if we could not have a conversation with the people who control the legislative body, with the people who control whether a bill would come out of committee or not, whether a bill would even be heard. This was all new to me. I didn't go to college for this. You know, I'm a community organizer. I'm responding to a need for my own personal need when my son was kicked out of preschool, 3 years old, right? African-American children in Ohio at that time. 58% of preschool expulsions and suspensions all across the state, but only 12% of the student body. So that's a huge racial disparity in the entire state. And the leverage that we were able to use was with a state senator who also happened to be the Senate Education Committee chairwoman. She also happened to be our state senator representing the Dayton area. And when we realized this, because most regular everyday people, just to be honest with you, we have no idea who represents us. We don't know who these people are most of the time. And so we literally had to do research. We had to make phone calls. We had to figure this thing out because there was a bill that had been sitting in committee, had not been brought up for a hearing, that would have repealed Ohio's zero tolerance law. And that, at that time, it was Senate Bill 167, but it had been introduced by someone in the opposing party. And so once we got wind of that, we were like, wow, this is exactly what we're trying to do. We need to repeal this, this bill that's criminalizing a lot of our kids, and predominantly Black kids in the state. And what's going on? Well, you know, why aren't we getting this done? And then we found out, oh, you have to contact the education chairperson. They're the ones who bring it up for a committee. And that happened to be Senator Laner. And we called her office. We knew she was a Republican, and we were like, well, hey, you know, we're your constituents. We live in Dayton. You happen to represent a slither of the city because of gerrymandering. That's a whole nother story. Gerrymandered districts in Ohio. And so we want to talk to you because our kids are getting kicked out of school. We have parents who are losing their jobs. We have parents who can't meet their basic needs because, you know, there's just a lot happening here, and we're interested in trying to change some policies so that schools understand that this is something that we can't do anymore, and that we also need resources for schools and community-based partnerships to help support the needs of the families and communities and teachers in our community. And to our, I mean, we were shocked, but she actually met with us. And we talked about this, and to make a long story short, it took us about 4.5 years to actually get a bill passed that would ban the suspensions, pre-K through third grade, suspensions and expulsions of children in all public and charter schools in Ohio. And that was signed into law by a Republican governor. And I tell that story because we had heard about that kind of work being done in places like California. It had been done in Oregon. It had been done in Connecticut. It had been done in a lot of different places, but this was the first place where it actually been done in a state that's considered more right-leaning. And certainly, there was certainly racial disparities as a part of the push to make sure that something like this could get done. I would be remiss not to mention that the leverage that we used was also that Ohio has something called the third grade reading law. Educators on here know if you live in a state like Michigan, Ohio, or Florida, those are 3 states that I know just off the top of my head that have these laws that if young people can't read by 3rd grade, then they're held back, right? And so our argument was, well, how are we expecting young people to read by 3rd grade if we're already kicking them out when they're 3? That doesn't make sense. And so Senator Laner was actually shocked. She was shocked when we showed her the data. She said, we're not doing this in Ohio. I said, how is it that you all pass a whole 3rd grade reading law and then look at suspensions and expulsions and attendance? I don't understand how you all pass the whole law. So that's like, just how laws are passed sometimes certainly don't include all communities. That people are not looking at all of the data to see who they're missing. And so that's a story of a grassroots community group that brought along a right-leaning state and also other advocacy organizations who thought it was too radical to even ask. They thought, oh, this is a Republican state, we're not going to even ask for this. But it was parents, it was grassroots parents from our group that we took on buses across the state every single week almost, when we were having to go to these what was called interested party meetings, and we were speaking for ourselves, and we were speaking from our own experience, lived experiences, where our kids were not getting the education that they needed. And so that, I think, in and of itself helped change some hearts and minds. It also helped to reveal something that was really hidden from our lawmakers. They're not seeing everything that's happening to everybody in the state. And so that's something, that's one of our biggest wins from our perspective, that it really gave a lot of pride to remember the parents that I told you we were working with. There was a sense of hopelessness, right? A sense of despair. There was just a lot of that. And then for them to feel like they had the power, right, to sit in the halls of justice or the halls of power and talk to legislators that actually make decisions every day that govern all of our lives, was something that was a huge motivator and a huge boost to the confidence of what power actually looks like and what it means to actually speak truth to power and to share your story with legislators and with people that actually change laws. And so that's something that we're very proud of. We've continued to take this model again to the national level in terms of how you support particularly parents and teacher and community relationships, how you really do that in a way that's authentic, that actually gives equitable power. And this is something that's controversial, but equitable power to parents and students who also have just as much stake in the education system as anyone else. When you think about it, a lot of times it's teachers and parents and students who have the least amount of voice when it comes to policies and practices, and that's not right. And so I'm happy. I'm sure there's probably a bunch of questions around that. So I'm happy to take some more questions if there are questions around that.
So there are, and it's actually brought up some overlying questions that touch on a lot of different topics that you've brought up. How do businesses that provide resources or teachers that are teaching in classrooms start with providing some of these resources? Either, let's say, there's a teacher in a classroom that needs to know how to get more technology, Chromebook, internet. How is there a business or service that's able to advise students or teachers or parents or families that don't have these resources readily available, and they might be able to be a resource? The question is, where do people start? You've gone from A to B, A to Z, and there are people, I know you're going to hopefully promote some resources available to how people can kind of take the next step and see what's most relevant to them locally.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's actually a really good question. There's a bunch of mutual aid networks that have popped up across the country, certainly during this pandemic, and also as a response to making sure that young people have the tools and technology and access that they need. There is a group in DC called Serve Your City. And they have been providing, I think they've provided up to 40,000 Chromebooks to families. And they're known as a mutual aid network. I'm sure that in a lot of other cities, there are other mutual aid networks that have popped up. Also, I believe, at least at the NEA level, they also have a resource page where they are offering particular resources to educators. I'll find that link and share that out in the resource section. But I know that the last time I was on a call with the new NEA president, Becky Pringle, she mentioned that they were in the process of creating a COVID-19 resource kind of tool and access list for educators. So around mental health, around, where to point students and families for resources, or where teachers can actually get support if they need it. So there's a lot out there, and I'm not sure if there's like a one-stop fits all, but there's certainly in certain cities that I'm happy to provide, some links to that people can at least start with looking at. And certainly the NEA probably has a lot on their page as well in terms of how do you start supporting around this technology issue. The other thing is, of course, is good old advocacy. If there's educators on here, if you're a part of your local union, or if you're part of any other kind of community organization, that's the other thing you can join. There's tons of community organizations in every city, especially now. If they're offering mutual aid work, if they're doing advocacy or organizing work, there's just a ton of organizations that are also education justice focused that teachers can be a part of. Back to that whole idea of allyship, right? That you can support families and communities a part of it. So I know in Oakland, there's the Black Organizing Project that does a lot of amazing work with educators. They got the support of the Teachers Union, the OEA, in their campaign to remove law enforcement from schools, which is something that's on the mind of a lot of people in terms of making like Black Lives Matter in and out of the classroom. Certainly criminalization is a huge part of that. When we look at the data around the preschool to prison pipeline, we're certainly seeing a lot of police interaction, unfortunately, even inside of our schools. Black Organizing Project in Oakland was actually founded because a young person was actually killed by an Oakland school police officer about 11 years ago. So that organization is there. There's another organization in the Bay Area out in San Francisco, Coleman Advocates, that also does a lot of that sort of A to Z organizing, advocacy, and policy work. So there's a bunch of different ways to get engaged, to try to get involved, and try to be supportive in your own backyards. Are there other questions, Carrie?
There certainly are. And there's questions about in the classroom, how do you incorporate an inclusive, engaging environment within the classroom? And of course, that there's a twofold question there, it being remote live.
Yeah, I think that's the key with the remote learning. So I don't know if folks, some educators may be on Twitter, but I know Education Week has been in the Twitterverse around some controversy on this. And it was an educator who actually had on his Zoom, he had as his backdrop, Black Lives Matter, no children in cages, women, human rights, or something like that. And so I would have suggested that even that in and of itself is a good way to even start a conversation with your students. The unfortunate thing, however, is that there was some parents, this was actually in Northern Virginia, the Alexandria school district. There was a parent who actually pushed back, and she actually wrote an opinion piece about it. And so I know that can get a little sketchy for some educators who don't want to get in trouble, right? And certainly they don't, want to cause issues with other administrators and things like that. So I would say that for teachers to make sure that you have the support of your administration, also organize with other teachers. There's always ways, I believe, to be inclusive even within the curriculum. There could be, videos that you could show that would start a conversation with your young people that you could use as a tool for teaching. There's some math educators that's doing that. There's some science educators that are finding links to make sure that they're being as inclusive and making sure that all of their young people feel seen and feel important and feel heard. To me, I think right now, that's a necessity. I talked about the trifecta earlier, where we're dealing with climate change that's getting even more serious, right? We see that with our folks out on the West Coast. We're dealing with, the Black Lives Matter movement, just national, right? Social unrest in the country because of law enforcement and Black bodies just being on video, being murdered. We're dealing with that, and then we're dealing with a global pandemic. So I just want to encourage you all as educators to just do the best you can and be as positive as possible. And also to know that activists like me, we see you. We appreciate you. We appreciate the fact that you all are also trying to figure this out. You all also have children that are probably sitting on their laptops next to you while you're trying to teach, and you can't also oversee what they're doing. It's a lot. We're all overwhelmed, right? There's a lot of anxiety. And so I would say not to put too much pressure on yourself, but to allow your students to feel comfortable and to feel free to share and that you also allow a little bit of grace for yourself and grace for your students. I don't think we need to be overly focused on tests. I don't think we need to be overly focused on even content right now, to be quite honest with you. Certainly, I think young people need to continue to learn, but I also think we need to keep in mind that we're dealing with a lot. We also have an upcoming probably contested election that's coming up in November. So there's just a lot of anxiety that's happening, and just recognizing that. And so there's going to be ways that you can bring in these lessons. I'm going to drop some names here in terms of tools that you can actually go to and use in terms of how to have these conversations. So number one is the Black Lives Matter at School. As an organization, there's some tools out there that they have. There's a website that I'll send a link to. There's also the Zen Education Project. They have a lot of different curriculum and tools that they provide directly to teachers. Some of it is free, actually. You can just go right on as an educator and download it yourself. The other one is the Rethinking Schools website. That is some of you as educators may already know about some of these tools. And then also Teaching Tolerance from the Southern Poverty Law Center. The other thing is, if you're teaching high school, there are some very engaging texts that I think that are really critical when it comes to Black students coming into their identity and understanding and reading. So if you're teaching, say for instance, an English class, if you're teaching a social studies or citizenship class, there's so many different books that could engage and have relevant conversations about what's happening now. So France Fanon has a number of different texts out there that I think that are critically important. Carter G. Woodson's book, The Miseducation of the Negro, there's so much in that text that is still relevant today. There is a lot of different tools and books that have been written out here for years that we certainly have not engaged in much lately, but they're certainly very much relevant. So I'll send a list of these tools, hopefully with your survey. So I'll make sure I get that over to the Berkeley team.
And I think that's what people are really looking for. What they put in their tool belt that they can start to initiate within their own classrooms. And
absolutely,
you know, what platform is the best for starting to share this and field questions and comments, and who do they include in the process with regards to principals and superintendents, and how do people not feel singled out yet included? I mean, there's so many little things that people have questions about, and I think creativity is going to be key. And I think like we're in a moment where we're forced to be creative, right? Like we're figuring out this technology, we're figuring out Zoom lessons, and don't get me wrong, and I don't know how other people feel about this, but I desire human connection. So I hope that, you know, when all of this is over, we can get back to in-person school. We can get back to that connection. A lot of us desire that. So I don't want people to think like this is forever. At least I hope it's not. Like we have to like figure all of this out, you know, on a computer and on Zoom. I think that it's going to be critical that, you know, we kind of pace ourselves, right? There's some tools out there, but don't feel like you have to do it all right now, I think is what I want to convey. There's certainly, like I said, the Rethinking Schools, Zen Education Project, they have tools on their website that's free, that's for educators that they can use. And I'll send a couple of other links as well. And this is stuff that's not gonna cost teachers a dime or school districts a dime to be able to use. That's exactly, I think, what people are looking for is some additional resources that they can pick up some best practices.
Right.
You know, people that have tried different creative tools.
Absolutely.
Did you have some slides to share, or did you want to bring up any?
I thought I was going to actually share some slides, but I don't think, looks like we have about 12 more minutes. I think that this has been great because it has been conversational. There's a lot that I know that, some questions. I'm not able to see the questions yet, but I know that there's probably more questions. I really, like I said, it stated at the beginning, I didn't want this to be a lecture style as much, because I know like this was something that people had burning questions, especially when I saw that pre-survey. I'm like, okay, I got to change this thing all the way up. I was like, we're going to have to talk tonight. So initially I was going to share some slides, but I think, and the slides were mostly just pictures and talking about the work that we did at Racial Justice Now, but I want to try to get in as many questions as possible so that I know and can make a list for myself of the resources that I'm talking about, can actually send that list out to the group.
Sounds good. Well, then there are maybe one or two more questions that, if we have some time, we'll do one or two, and then we'll finish out with showing and letting people know where they can.
Yeah. Is there anything in the chat? Because some people may be using the chat feature too. I'm not sure.
So I am looking at chat
Okay.
as well as Q&A. So I've been pulling questions from both, as well as our survey.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. Yeah, so I think, if we don't have any other questions right now, one of the other things that I wanted to mention in terms of some of the things that we're doing now, at least at Brightbeam, particularly around the internet access, there's actually going to be a week of action around that's coming up. I don't have the link to that right now because it's actually still in the planning process, but it is something that maybe the UC Berkeley team, if they can send it out later so that people can figure out if you're in one of those areas where there's an action taking place, maybe you can be involved in that in some kind of way, or, if you want to be, that's going to be another tool or another process for action in terms of Internet for All. So that's coming up the first week of October. Where there's going to be an action in terms of calling on the FCC to make sure that they are doing what they need to do to try to make Internet for All a success. But then there's also local efforts and also statewide efforts. Each state has electrical or regulatory boards when it comes to utility companies or utility regulations. So I know that there's going to be some actions around trying to get Internet included as a part of the utility regulatory board, to make sure that there are some parameters around, whether young people say, we know that young people are in school from August to June, families can't be cut off of internet access during this pandemic, and we know that we have to use internet to do education and Zoom classes if families don't have the money to pay. Unfortunately, right now, Comcast, Time Warner, whatever company is providing internet service can cut families off if they don't have the money to pay. So that's a disservice. And so we're working on different efforts like that. So I wanted to make sure, because technology came up a lot in the survey, and I wanted to make sure folks know that there are organizations out here that's pushing for internet, affordable internet, but just internet for all.
And that's a big topic, like you said, because it is a utility and being successful in today's environment.
Absolutely.
Stephen, I don't know if you wanted to add to our post survey and how people can take a look at our recording. There's been some questions around people that might have joined late or want to revisit a lot of the topics, and then how people will receive links to the different resources that Zakiya mentioned.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Zakiya. This was really terrific, and I want to thank again everyone who participated, even though we're not hearing their voices today. The way in which you participated by taking time to fill out this survey and to really think through these challenging questions, and there's a lot that it's still out there, and we really appreciate that, and it continues to be part of our conversation prior to this workshop.
Right.
We will have a recording available. This will need to go through some post-production, but we expect within a week or two for it to be available. And what we will do is post that on the event page on Eventbrite. So that will be accessible for everyone. And we'll put another email out to this group so that you have that and can share that. Because I think there's a lot of educators out there. We're one time zone on one coast right now.
Yeah.
and on a busy Tuesday at the beginning of
Right.
a unique school year. So we like the
Very much
fact
so.
that we'll have a production that can share this.
Absolutely. And I just, you know, I would be remiss not to just say to the educators and parents and everyone that's on this call, pace yourself. It's okay. I know that a lot of us, including me, is feeling under a lot of pressure. We're juggling a bunch of different things. We've had to adjust. Some of us have completely had to do a 180 in our lives. It's been a lot to adjust to, you know, having your kids home 24/7, the lockdowns, the isolation. I just want to say I see you, right? I felt the anxiety in that survey, and I just want to acknowledge that, and just want to be encouraging to each and every one of you as educators, as parents, wherever you are in life, to just know that, not to be a cliche, but we are in this all together. I know I've been seeing that on a lot of placards and billboards and stuff everywhere, but I think that that does make people feel better to know that they're not alone. And for teachers, I can't imagine having to figure out, right, all the pressures that you're getting probably from the district to do education the same way you were supposed to do it in person, which, right, is not realistic to do on a Zoom. And then all the tests and all of that, you know, stuff that continues to come up. And then also trying to take care of your own families if you have a family. And then also if you lost somebody from COVID, we haven't even talked about that. There's a lot of students who've lost parents, grandparents, siblings, somebody that's close to them from COVID. Thankfully, I haven't lost a close relative, but I have lost a distant relative from COVID. So this is really just a very trying time with the trifecta that I mentioned earlier: social unrest, persistent social unrest, as we continue to see Black lives cut down in the streets of our cities, as we continue to see global warming and climate change and all of those different things. So there's, just know that, you know, don't feel the pressure. I don't think you should feel the pressure to try to get everything right, especially in this moment. I do think that we all do the best that we can. I'm going to encourage everyone, because I'm doing that, is that we all do the best that we can in this moment. We all do the best that we can to meet our children where they are, to meet our students and their families where they are. I didn't get a chance to really go into this, but I'm also very concerned by some of the school district's policies that I have seen coming out with virtual learning. Some of the requirements for young people to keep their cameras on, right? There has to be another way for engagement to also keep dignity for some students. There may be a reason why that student doesn't feel comfortable with you seeing their background, right? Or there may be a reason, all kinds of reasons why they just don't, they may be self-conscious, right? There may be something happening that they don't want to be on camera. There's been some other policies that I've seen that have nothing to do with education. It's like, in this moment, why are we being so controlling and putting all these different, you know, mechanisms in place? Unfortunately, I'm sure all of you heard about the young man, the African-American student out in Colorado, who a teacher called the police on him for having a toy gun on virtual. And having the cops show up at his house at 12 years old. I just think that, you know, there's just a lot that's happening. I don't think that we need to be going in a direction where we're furthering the criminalization into the personal homes of families. So just being cognizant of that, having conversations, if you're in meetings or on your building leadership team, you know, feeling confident at sometimes, if you feel like you need to push back, if you feel like there's a policy or procedure that's being recommended that is not safe for the students, that you know your students, your students' families. If you feel like that particular policy is not safe for them, you know, find the courage to speak up, right? And say, I don't think that this would work. It doesn't make sense. That's how we literally make Black lives matter in and out of our classrooms. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Steve. I'm encouraged by all of the questions, the comments that I've seen, and hopefully, you know, I wish all of you a successful year, a healthy year, and a safe year. Thank you very much for allowing me to have your time today and to speak with you.
Thank you, Zakiya. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for Teaching Across Scenes. See you next time.